Thousands of families and individuals are living paycheck to paycheck at risk of eviction, and more have lost their employment due to COVID-19 measures. Today on City Chat, Executive Director of Community Shelter Board Michelle Heritage is here to talk about the potential wave of evictions and how the community can prepare for it. Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us on City Chat today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're talking about something kind of serious here. Could you first, before we get into some of the questions, explain to our viewers, what the moratorium is and how that is intertwined with the housing stabilization?
So the moratorium on evictions was put in place to really stave off kind of a big wave of evictions because people across our community and certainly across the country as well would not be able to pay rent because they had effects from the employment they had from the coronavirus. And so, for example, if their hours were cut or if they had to stay home. And so there was a real concern across the entire nation and certainly in our community that we would have a mass eviction. And that would be very bad at a time when we were supposed to stay home, stay isolated, and mask up and all of that.
Right. Yeah. And how has the pandemic affected people living in poverty?
It's been really difficult for people in poverty. I will tell you in a general sense, anything that happens in our community, whether it be a fire in an apartment complex or the Great Recession or a pandemic, tends to disproportionately affect people who are very low income. They already have the least amount of resources to begin with. And then, when any resources are taken away or there's a disruption, they're really at risk for things like homelessness.
Yeah.
And so, if you're working as a server at a restaurant, for example, and your hours get cut because the restaurant closed down, you're really at a huge potential that you could lose your housing and become homeless. And so always we should think about whatever's affecting the rest of us. For very low income individuals, it's much worse.
Was it helpful in your perspective and just with the data, was it helpful in staving off homelessness?
Oh, absolutely. So a couple things came together to really help on really helping people who were very low income. The eviction moratorium was one important piece. And it was just a part of the puzzle because it really helped people that had the effects from the pandemic to be able to stay where they were and to not get evicted. The second piece that really helped was the unemployment money that came through for folks and the stimulus. And then the third piece of the puzzle that our community did really, really well was to get dollars over to Impact Community Action and others to be able to help people pay off their back rent so they didn't get behind.
Oh, wow.
We also saw legal aid being able to do a lot of intervention down at the eviction court to really help mediate between landlords and tenants to save that housing and restabilize people. We see the impact in the homeless system because the numbers of families who have experienced homelessness during the pandemic is the lowest number in 15 years.
Oh,
So if you ever really wanted a test case, do these kinds of things really help very low income people? The answer is absolutely. And we're seeing it in the homeless system that less families have entered shelter than we've ever seen before.
so why, I guess this might not be a great question, but like, why is there going to be an end to it, to the moratorium?
Well, I think ultimately, landlords are business people, and landlords for the most part are good, honest brokers, and they run a business. And we want to make sure at some point, that they begin to be paid again. And so, I think what we really want to take from this lesson is that what we should be focusing on in the eviction court is not how to evict people quickly and be efficient at evicting and turning to eviction as the first thing we do when a tenant is in trouble with their back rent, but instead, could we have services like legal aid, impact community action, community mediation services that are going to help bridge between the landlord and the tenant? And that really our philosophy should be to try to preserve the tenancy, the housing stabilization at all costs
Yeah.
with resources, with mediation. And that is going to be effective in the downstream of people not ending up homeless.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thank you for that. It kind of goes into the next question. Why and how is housing just such an important puzzle to be, to create a vibrant community?
Well, I have to tell you, housing's a basic need. When you think of the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we all learned it in Psych 101, remember?
Hmm.
It's food and housing. And those are our basic needs. And if we can't meet those basic needs, nothing else can be met. And so, what we find when people are not stable in their housing, when they don't have access to safe, decent, affordable housing, you see mental health challenges, you
Yeah.
see the increase of substance abuse and overdoses, you see depressed, anxious children, you see failure in grades, you see infant mortality increase, you name it, any social ill is directly connected to the lack of safe, decent, affordable housing. And so when we think about what should be at the bottom of the pyramid of a healthy community, we've got to make sure that people have safe, decent, affordable housing. And unfortunately, our community, like many others across the country, does not have enough of that. And so we see homelessness as a result, and we see lots of other social ills in terms of people having to live in substandard housing and all of the social determinants that come from that, which can be very negative. As I said, school failure, homelessness, infant mortality, crime, drug abuse, mental health.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about the lessons that we can take away from the moratorium ending. What are some of the challenges that we're going to face with it being gone?
Well, I looked today at the how many evictions are waiting and have been filed at the eviction court. So far for the month of July, 677 evictions have been filed. Um, in June, there were 1,200 evictions filed. These things are all just waiting. Um, there's many, many more that have been filed throughout 2021, but there's not been action taken on. And so we are expecting a wave of evictions to occur when the moratorium is taken away. And the challenge with that is, where will people go?
Yeah.
Especially people who are very low income. We literally have 4 or 5 households that need that apartment for every apartment that's available. And so what that does is it drives up the cost of housing, and landlords also start to screen people out who have had any challenges, including an eviction. And so once you get evicted, it stays on your record for the rest of your life. And then landlords look at that and say they've had an eviction in a market like Columbus, which is very, very challenging because there's so much competition.
Yeah.
If you've got something like that on your record, you'll be turned away. And the housing then maybe that you can afford to get that a landlord's willing to rent to you may be substandard. Or you could actually end up homeless because you have nowhere else to turn. What we have to do is, again, try to stave off as many of those evictions as possible. The city, for example, our community has passed legislation on source of income, which forbids landlords from discriminating if an organization like Community Shelter Board was helping them with rent, or if they had a Section 8 voucher. Um, we're putting things together to encourage landlords to give second chance renters an opportunity to rent their properties, which include risk mitigation funds, so that if a tenant leaves or the property is damaged, we help pay back. Incentives for landlords to lower their barriers to housing and give second chance renters a chance. We'll give them a bonus to be able to do that. And I think we have to really look at the continuation of some rental subsidies.
Yeah.
Just in 2018 and 2019, Franklin County lost 18,000 units of housing that was below $950. At the same time, about 22,000 units above $1,300 a month came online. So what you're seeing is the lower rent apartments are getting more and more and more expensive. So naturally occurring affordable housing is disappearing.
Yeah.
One of the things we I think should do is really think about a comprehensive strategy to build more affordable housing at all income levels. So, workforce housing for those nurses and care workers that are working at our hospital systems and our nursing homes, and at Starbucks, and then for very, very low income people. that really may not be able to work full time or at very low wage jobs. We've got to find a way to supplement their rent so that they can be able to afford housing. So it's both help pay the rent. We've got to build a lot more housing. And then as a community, again, we've got to think about what does it mean to make a living wage? There's not a single county in the United States where you can work full time at minimum wage and afford housing without being rent cost burdened.
Yeah.
So we've got to think about wages. It's a package together. Housing, wages.
It's obvious that you're very passionate about what you do and well like educated and you know your stuff. Like, could you share a little bit about what drives you and what inspires you to just be such a fighter for this?
Well, here's the thing. So, I was raised in a middle class home, and I have this belief that when you have not suffered under the weight of poverty, you start to rack up every single day what I call a joyful debt. And the debt is something you get to pay back every day in service to others. And so I think as a kind of principle of fairness and equity in our community, we need to lift up those that may not have had every opportunity to be successful and to give them those opportunities. And so a lot of some of the things that are challenging in our country and our community are because of policy decisions that have been made over the course of many decades. And the great news there is we made those decisions. We can make other policies and take other pathways, which means this is not intractable. We can solve our own problems because we made our own problems. And so that's kind of what keeps me going is issues of equity, fairness, paying off my joyful debt, and knowing that we can solve these problems.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Michelle, for your time. I'm Josie Smith. Thanks for watching City Chat on CTV.